3 days after his uncle's funeral, Nathan Cole received a letter that would change the entire course of his life. Inside was a certificate of inheritance for 1,100 acres of land, signed and sealed by a county court. He assumed he had just become the owner of some quiet, overgrown farmland somewhere out past the highway. He had no idea that on that land stood an entire gated community, one that had spent years pretending it belonged to no one else but themselves. When he finally drove through the front gate to see his inheritance for the first time, a woman in an HOA uniform stepped in front of his car and told him flatly that this was private property and he was not welcome. Nathan simply smiled, reached into his jacket, and pulled out the deed. 10 minutes later, panic began spreading through the entire neighborhood, because a secret they had buried for years was about to surface. The days leading up to that letter had been quiet, almost uneventful, the kind of ordinary week that gives no warning of the turn it is about to take. Nathan Cole was 42 years old, a former construction engineer who had spent the better part of 2 decades reading blueprints, inspecting foundations, and solving problems that other people considered impossible. He lived a modest life in a small rented house, 2 states away, the kind of life built on discipline rather than luxury. His uncle, Walter Coleman, had been a quiet man, the sort of relative who sent a card at Christmas and rarely called otherwise. Walter had lived alone for most of his adult life, and nobody in the family really knew the full extent of what he owned or how he had spent his final years. When the attorney handling the estate called Nathan to arrange a meeting, Nathan expected paperwork about a modest house, maybe some savings, nothing more. He drove to the small law office downtown, sat across from a tired-looking attorney named Robert Hale, and listened as the man explained that Walter Coleman had, in fact, owned 1,100 acres of land in a rural county 3 hours away. Nathan sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finally asking the obvious question, which was what exactly was on that land. Robert Hale admitted that the estate records were surprisingly thin, listing only the original agricultural zoning from decades earlier, with no mention of any development, structures, or leases. Everyone in the room assumed the same thing, that it was probably farmland, maybe with an old barn or two, nothing that required urgent attention. Nathan signed the necessary documents, thanked the attorney, and told him he planned to drive out there that weekend just to see it with his own eyes. He packed a bag, filled his truck with gas, and set out early on a Saturday morning, following the directions on the GPS toward a rural county he had never once visited in his life. The drive took just over 3 hours, winding through small towns, past fields, and eventually toward a stretch of road that seemed unusually well maintained for something leading to empty farmland. When the GPS announced that he had arrived at his destination, Nathan slowed the truck and stared through the windshield in confusion. Instead of open pastures or a weathered old barn, there was a massive stone entrance gate with iron lettering spelling out the name of a residential community. Beyond the gate stretched paved streets lined with manicured lawns, a shimmering man-made lake, a clubhouse with tall windows, tennis courts, and a small park with wooden benches arranged beneath mature trees. For a moment, Nathan assumed he had entered the wrong address, that some algorithm had simply guided him to the wrong coordinates. He pulled over, checked the documents again, cross-referenced the parcel numbers with the GPS coordinates, and confirmed that everything matched exactly. The land in front of him, all of it, the gate, the lake, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, the winding streets full of comfortable homes, belonged legally to him. He sat there for several minutes, simply staring at the community sprawled before him, trying to process how a man as quiet and private as his uncle had ended up owning something this large and this developed. He stepped out of the truck for a moment, standing on the shoulder of the road, and simply looked at the scale of what stretched before him. Rows of 2-story homes with matching shutters lined the streets beyond the gate, each one landscaped with the kind of precision that suggested strict community rules rather than individual taste. A groundskeeper's cart rolled slowly along the far side of the lake, trimming hedges that had clearly been shaped that way for years, not months. Nathan thought about his uncle, a man who wore the same flannel jacket to every family gathering for a decade, and tried to imagine him having any connection at all to a place this polished. Nothing about the image fit together in his mind, and that mismatch was exactly what convinced him he needed to walk through that gate, rather than simply drive away confused. He got back into the truck, took a slow breath, and pulled forward toward the entrance, unsure of what he would find, but certain that he needed answers. As he approached the gate, a uniformed security guard stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Nathan rolled down his window and explained calmly that he believed he had just inherited this property and wanted to take a look around. The guard's expression shifted from mild irritation to something closer to alarm, and he immediately radioed someone inside the community. Within minutes, a woman marched briskly toward the gate, wearing a blazer with an embroidered HOA emblem stitched over the pocket, her posture rigid and her expression sharp. She introduced herself as Diane Marsh, president of the Homeowners Association, and asked Nathan exactly what business he had trying to enter a private community uninvited. Nathan explained again, patiently, that he had recently inherited the land the community sat upon, and he simply wanted to understand what he now owned. Diane Marsh laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and told him that this community had existed for years, and that whoever the previous landowner had been, that person had long since forfeited any claim to the property. She said the phrase again for emphasis, forfeited any claim, as though repeating it might make it true through sheer force of tone. Nathan reached for the folder on his passenger seat and handed her a copy of the certified deed through the open window, watching her expression carefully as she skimmed it. Diane barely glanced at the document before handing it back, informing him coolly that anyone with a printer could produce a piece of paper claiming almost anything. She told him that if he did not turn his truck around immediately, she would have no choice but to call the sheriff and have him charged with trespassing. Nathan did not raise his voice or argue further, which seemed to unsettle Diane more than any confrontation would have. He simply nodded, thanked her for her time, and turned his truck back toward the main road, watching the gate shrink in his rearview mirror as he pulled away. He did not go far, though, stopping at a small diner a few miles down the highway to gather his thoughts over a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before he even touched it. Something about the entire encounter felt wrong to him, not just the hostility, but the confidence behind it, as though Diane Marsh genuinely believed the law was on her side. Before he even finished his coffee, Nathan called Robert Hale and asked him to dig deeper into the property records, because something about that gated community did not add up. Robert promised to look into it first thing Monday morning, and Nathan drove the 3 hours home with far more questions than he had arrived with that morning. By Wednesday of that week, Robert Hale called Nathan with news that made the entire situation far stranger than either of them had anticipated. According to county records, the residential community, referred to internally as Coleman Ridge Estates, had been built and expanded over the course of nearly 15 years. Homeowners within the community owned their individual houses, and the small parcels of land directly beneath them, purchased fair and square through standard real estate transactions. However, the surrounding land, the roads, the common areas, the lake, the clubhouse grounds, and the tennis courts, all sat on the larger 1,100-acre parcel that had never been subdivided or sold. That land had remained under Walter Coleman's name the entire time, quietly accumulating property tax bills that Walter, for reasons no one could yet explain, had continued to pay without ever visiting or developing it himself. Robert explained that somewhere along the way, likely not long after the community's first phase was completed, the Homeowners Association had begun operating as though the surrounding acreage belonged to them collectively. They had built the clubhouse, installed the lake, paved the internal roads, and constructed the tennis courts, all without ever securing a formal easement, lease, or purchase agreement from the actual landowner. For years, the association had been collecting monthly dues from residents, charging fees for use of the amenities, and even leasing portions of the parking areas to a nearby event company for weekend gatherings. Nathan sat quietly on the phone as Robert listed figure after figure, dues collected, event fees charged, maintenance costs billed to residents for infrastructure the association did not actually own. The total revenue collected over the years, based on preliminary estimates, easily reached into the millions of dollars, all generated from land that legally belonged to someone else entirely. Nathan finally understood what had likely happened, piecing the story together the way he once pieced together blueprints on a job site. Walter Coleman had probably purchased the land decades earlier, perhaps intending to develop it himself or simply to hold on to it as an investment, before a developer approached him or simply began building without full authorization. As Walter aged and withdrew further from public life, the association likely assumed that since no one ever challenged their use of the land, no one ever would. They had built an entire community's identity around amenities sitting on borrowed ground, all while believing that an elderly recluse in failing health would never notice or care enough to intervene. Nathan asked Robert directly whether this meant the Homeowners Association had been operating illegally for years, and Robert answered carefully that from what he could see so far, that appeared to be exactly the case. The two men agreed to meet in person the following week to review the full scope of records before deciding on their next move. Robert also raised a question that had been nagging at him since he first opened Walter's file, wondering aloud why a man who paid his property taxes faithfully every single year had never once stepped forward to challenge a community built entirely on his own land. He pulled Walter's tax filings from a full decade earlier and noticed something strange, a handwritten note attached to one of the older payment records, faded but still legible, simply stating that the matter would be addressed when the time was right. Nathan sat with that phrase for a long while after the call ended, turning it over in his mind, wondering whether his uncle had been waiting for something, or perhaps someone, before ever confronting the community himself. It occurred to him that Walter may have known exactly what was happening on that land the entire time, choosing silence, not out of ignorance, but out of some private, unexplained patience that Nathan would now have to finish on his behalf. That thought settled over him with a quiet weight, transforming the entire situation from a simple legal dispute into something closer to unfinished family business. He decided then that whatever came next, he would see it through properly, the way his uncle apparently intended all along. In the days that followed, Nathan drafted a formal letter through Robert's office, requesting a meeting with the Homeowners Association's board to discuss the boundaries of the property and the future of the land beneath the community. The letter was polite, professional, and deliberately non-confrontational, simply asking for cooperation in reviewing survey records and discussing a path forward that would work for everyone involved. He mailed it certified, ensuring there would be a clear record of delivery, and waited for a response that he assumed would come within a reasonable amount of time. Instead of a response, what came back was silence for nearly 2 weeks, followed by an email forwarded to him from a resident who had grown curious about the situation. The Homeowners Association had held an emergency meeting, and during that meeting, Diane Marsh had stood before hundreds of residents and painted Nathan as a greedy outsider attempting to extort money from hardworking families. According to residents who later described the meeting, Diane told the crowd that a man claiming to be a distant relative of the previous landowner was trying to seize control of community property for personal profit. She suggested that his claims were likely fraudulent, that real estate scammers frequently targeted established communities like theirs, and that the board intended to fight back on behalf of every homeowner present. The association sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood mailing list, describing Nathan in vague but alarming terms, warning residents not to speak with him if he approached their homes or contacted them directly. Word spread quickly through the community's private online groups, where residents began sharing increasingly exaggerated versions of the story, some claiming Nathan intended to bulldoze the clubhouse, others insisting he planned to charge residents rent simply to drive on their own streets. Nathan learned about all of this secondhand, through Robert, who had been contacted by a concerned resident asking whether any of it was true. Robert advised Nathan firmly to stay quiet and let the facts speak through official channels, rather than responding publicly to rumors designed to provoke a reaction. A handful of residents, unsettled by the tone of Diane's message, reached out to Nathan directly after finding his contact information through the county's public court filings. One of them, a retired mechanic named Gary Holt who had lived in the community for nearly 9 years, admitted over the phone that something about the association's panic felt disproportionate for a claim they insisted was fraudulent. Gary explained that he had always found the yearly dues increases strange, given how little visible improvement ever seemed to follow them, and he wondered aloud whether Nathan's arrival might finally explain years of unanswered questions. Nathan thanked him for reaching out but kept the conversation brief, careful not to say anything that could later be twisted into evidence of him pressuring residents. Still, that short phone call stayed with him, a quiet reminder that not everyone inside that gate had been fooled, and that somewhere within the community, doubt was already beginning to take root on its own. Nathan found the entire situation deeply frustrating, but he trusted Robert's judgment and resisted the urge to defend himself directly to the community. Instead, he channeled his energy into something far more productive, hiring an independent land surveying firm to conduct a full boundary review of the entire 1,100-acre parcel. He also brought in a county land inspector to formally document exactly which structures sat where, ensuring that every measurement would hold up under legal scrutiny if the matter ever reached a courtroom. The surveying team spent nearly 2 weeks walking the property, using modern equipment to map every inch of the boundary lines against the original recorded plat from decades earlier. Nathan drove out twice during that period, staying at a small motel outside the county rather than attempting to enter the gated community itself, watching from a respectful distance as the surveyors worked. The lead surveyor, a methodical man named James Foster who had worked county land disputes for over 20 years, told Nathan privately that he had rarely seen a boundary line so cleanly and completely ignored by everything built around it. Foster explained that whoever had planned the community's layout must have either overlooked the original recorded plat entirely or simply chosen not to consult it, an oversight that seemed almost impossible for a development of this size and cost. Nathan asked him whether that kind of mistake happened often, and Foster admitted that it usually did not at this scale, which only deepened Nathan's suspicion that the oversight had been deliberate rather than accidental. He wanted no accusations of interference, no claims that he had pressured anyone or tampered with equipment. understanding that patience and precision would serve him far better than confrontation. When the survey results finally came back, they confirmed exactly what Robert had suspected from the earlier records review, though seeing it laid out in precise measurements still struck Nathan with force. The clubhouse, the entire structure, along with its surrounding patio and parking area, sat squarely within the boundaries of the 1,100-acre parcel. The community lake, artificially constructed and stocked with fish for resident enjoyment, had been dug directly into land that had never left Walter Coleman's ownership. The tennis courts, the internal road network connecting every home in the neighborhood, and even the grand stone entrance gate itself, all stood on land that legally belonged to Nathan. There was no recorded easement granting the association rights to build on that land, no lease agreement, no license, and no documentation of any kind suggesting the previous landowner had ever authorized a single structure. The inspector's final report used blunt, official language, stating simply that the homeowners association had constructed and continued to operate multiple structures on private property without legal authorization of any kind. Robert reviewed the findings with Nathan and told him plainly that this was now far more than a boundary dispute. It was a matter that could reshape the entire community's future. Armed with the surveyor's findings and the inspector's official report, Nathan authorized Robert to send a formal notice to the Homeowners Association's board of directors. The letter stated clearly that the association had 30 days to enter good faith negotiations regarding a legal lease or purchase agreement for the land beneath their shared amenities. It further stated that if no agreement could be reached, or if the association refused to engage in discussions entirely, Nathan would pursue all available legal remedies, including the removal of unauthorized structures from his property. The letter was measured, factual, and free of threats, beyond mind, what the law itself allowed, exactly the kind of communication Robert had built his reputation on drafting. When it arrived at the association's office, Diane Marsh reportedly read it aloud during a closed board meeting and laughed, telling the other board members that the man had no idea who he was dealing with. She assured them confidently that 15 years of continuous use had likely established some form of legal claim on the association's behalf, though she offered no citation or legal basis for that belief whatsoever. At the next general community meeting, held in the very clubhouse now under legal scrutiny, Diane stood before a packed room and declared that the association's legal team, which in reality consisted of a single semi-retired attorney who rarely returned calls, would handle the matter swiftly. She told residents not to worry, insisting that people like Nathan filed baseless claims all the time, hoping for quick settlements, and that the board had no intention of giving him a single dollar. Some residents applauded, reassured by her confidence, while others sat quietly, exchanging uneasy glances with their neighbors. A retired schoolteacher named Carol Ashford raised her hand near the back of the room and asked a simple question, wondering aloud whether the board could actually show everyone the documents, proving the association legally owned the land in question. Diane's expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered, telling Carol that such records were confidential and available only to board members for security reasons. That answer did not sit well with several residents, who began quietly discussing amongst themselves after the meeting ended, wondering why something so basic would require such secrecy. Over the next several days, small clusters of neighbors began meeting on porches and in driveways rather than waiting for the association's official channels to provide any clarity. A former accountant named Susan Reyes, who lived 2 streets from the clubhouse, offered to review whatever financial documents the board would provide, having grown suspicious of the association's bookkeeping long before Nathan ever appeared. When her request was met with the same vague refusals Carol had received, Susan began quietly compiling her own records from years of dues, statements, and public meeting minutes she had saved out of habit. She noticed inconsistencies almost immediately, expenses that never matched the amenities they were supposedly funding, and repair costs that seemed to double in price from one year to the next, without explanation. She shared her findings with a small group of trusted neighbors, careful not to alarm the wider community until she had something concrete enough to stand behind. That quiet, careful documentation would later prove far more damaging to the board than anything Nathan himself ever said in public. Over the following days, a small but growing group of residents began asking pointed questions in the community's private online forums and at informal gatherings near the mailboxes. They requested copies of the original land purchase agreements, the deeds establishing common area ownership, anything that would put their minds at ease regarding the legitimacy of the community's amenities. The board repeatedly stalled, offering vague explanations about pending legal reviews, and advising residents to trust the process rather than seek outside information. This response, rather than calming anyone down, only deepened the growing suspicion among homeowners who had lived in the community for years and simply wanted clarity. Meanwhile, Nathan's 30-day deadline continued to approach, with no response from the association beyond Diane's public dismissals and private assurances to her board that everything would resolve itself favorably. When the deadline passed without any formal communication from the association's legal representative, Robert filed a civil lawsuit on Nathan's behalf, seeking a court determination on rightful ownership and use of the disputed land. The lawsuit moved through the county court system more quickly than either Nathan or Robert had anticipated, largely because the underlying facts were so clearly documented. When the first hearing finally arrived, the small county courtroom filled with an unusual mixture of curious residents, local reporters covering what had quickly become the talk of the county, and the tense, formally dressed representatives of both sides. Diane Marsh sat beside the association's aging attorney, her posture stiff, her expression a careful mask of confidence that did not entirely reach her eyes. When given the opportunity to speak, she repeated the same arguments she had offered residents for weeks, insisting that 15 years of continuous, unchallenged use had effectively established the association's right to the land. She claimed the previous owner had known about the development for years and had never once objected, treating his silence as a form of implicit consent that any reasonable court should honor. The judge listened patiently, occasionally jotting notes, before finally asking Diane's attorney to produce any documentation supporting these claims, a request that was met with an uncomfortable pause before he admitted no such formal documentation existed. When it came time for Robert to present Nathan's case, he moved through the evidence methodically, laying out each document like pieces of a puzzle finally being assembled into a complete picture. He presented the original recorded plat map from decades earlier, showing the 1,100-acre parcel exactly as it had always existed, undivided and unsold. He introduced Walter Coleman's property tax records, demonstrating an unbroken chain of ownership and continuous tax payments, stretching back long before the community's first home had ever been built. He submitted Walter's will alongside the certified deed, transferring ownership to Nathan, establishing beyond doubt exactly who held legal title to the land in question. Finally, Robert presented a series of satellite images spanning multiple years, time-stamped and sourced from public archives, clearly showing the gradual construction of the clubhouse, lake, tennis courts, and road network directly atop land that public records confirmed had never changed ownership. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, forming an argument that grew increasingly difficult to dispute with every passing minute. At one point, the judge asked Robert directly whether the satellite imagery could be independently verified, and Robert calmly confirmed that the same images were available through a public federal archive, meaning anyone in the room could pull them up themselves within minutes. That single exchange seemed to land harder than any of the earlier testimony, because it made clear that nothing being presented depended on Nathan's word alone. The association's attorney attempted a brief cross-examination, asking Robert whether the previous landowner had ever filed a formal complaint about the community's construction over the years. Robert answered honestly that no complaint had been filed, but reminded the court that the absence of a complaint from an elderly, private individual was not the same thing as legal permission, a distinction the judge appeared to note carefully. By the time Robert concluded his presentation, the mood inside the courtroom had shifted noticeably, the earlier murmurs of doubt about Nathan's claim replaced by a heavier, more uncertain silence. During a recess in the proceedings, something unexpected began to unfold outside the courtroom doors, as reporters covering the case started digging into the Homeowners Association's financial history out of simple curiosity. What they found, and what soon became part of the ongoing legal discovery process, painted a picture far uglier than a simple boundary dispute. Financial records subpoenaed as part of the lawsuit revealed that the association had collected well over $3 million in dues, event fees, and amenity charges over the preceding decade. Rather than maintaining a properly documented reserve fund as required by standard association bylaws, large portions of that money appeared to have been spent with little oversight or accountability. Diane Marsh's compensation as association president, technically supposed to be a modest stipend for volunteer service, had quietly grown into a substantial salary paid out through a series of vaguely labeled administrative accounts. Records showed payments for personal vehicle leases, several out-of-state trips labeled as association conferences, and expensive dinners charged to accounts meant for community maintenance and repairs. Susan Reyes, the former accountant who had quietly begun compiling her own records weeks earlier, submitted her findings to Robert's office once the lawsuit's discovery process officially opened the association's books to scrutiny. Her independent analysis lined up almost exactly with what the subpoenaed bank statements eventually confirmed, giving Robert a head start in identifying which transactions deserved the closest attention during testimony. When these details became public knowledge, first through courtroom testimony and then through local news coverage, The reaction among residents shifted from uneasy suspicion to outright fury. The following community meeting, originally scheduled to discuss unrelated landscaping decisions, turned instead into a chaotic gathering dominated entirely by residents demanding answers about the financial revelations. Carol Ashford, the same retired teacher who had first questioned the board weeks earlier, stood up and read aloud a list of expenses pulled directly from the subpoenaed records, her voice steady despite the anger clearly building beneath it. Other residents followed, sharing their own frustrations about years of rising dues that never seemed to translate into visible improvements, now finally understanding where at least some of that money had actually gone. Diane attempted to defend herself, claiming the expenses had all been properly approved and that residents simply misunderstood the complexities of running a community this size. Her explanations, however, grew increasingly tangled and inconsistent, and several board members who had stood beside her for years suddenly found themselves unable to offer any defense of their own. Two board members, visibly shaken by the scale of public anger directed at the association, stood up in the middle of the meeting and announced their immediate resignation, stating simply that they had not been aware of the extent of the financial mismanagement. The meeting ended in disarray, but for the first time since Nathan had first driven through that gate, the balance of power within the community had visibly begun to shift. Several weeks later, the court issued its final ruling on the underlying question of land ownership, and the decision left little room for interpretation. The judge ruled unequivocally that Nathan Cole held full and undisputed legal title to the entire 1,100-acre parcel, including every structure, road, and amenity the homeowners association had built without authorization. The ruling confirmed that the association possessed no legal easement, lease, or ownership claim to the disputed land, and that 15 years of unauthorized use did not, under the applicable state law, create any binding right to continue that use indefinitely. As the rightful owner, Nathan now legally held the power to demand removal of the unauthorized structures, to charge the association substantial back payment for years of unpermitted use, or even to fence off the land entirely and deny access altogether. Diane Marsh sat motionless as the ruling was read, her earlier confidence completely drained from her expression, replaced by the slow realization of just how badly she had miscalculated. Reporters outside the courthouse captured the moment residents who had gathered to hear the verdict began speaking among themselves. Some relieved that a resolution had finally been reached, others anxious about what might come next for their homes and their community. In the days following the ruling, many observers assumed Nathan would pursue the most aggressive options now legally available to him, perhaps fencing off the amenities entirely, or demanding an enormous financial settlement from the association. Instead, Nathan asked Robert to draft a different kind of proposal, one built not around punishment but around a fair and sustainable path forward for everyone actually living in the community. The proposal required the Homeowners Association to issue a formal, public apology, acknowledging years of unauthorized use of private land without proper disclosure to residents. It required the association to pay reasonable compensation for that historical use, calculated fairly rather than punitively, and to immediately enter a legitimate, transparent long-term lease agreement for the land beneath the shared amenities going forward. Finally, it required a complete restructuring of the association's leadership, removing anyone who had knowingly participated in or concealed the years of financial mismanagement from their positions of authority. Should the association refuse these terms, Nathan made clear through Robert that he retained every right the court had just confirmed, including closing the gate, shutting down the clubhouse, and reclaiming the amenity land entirely. Faced with that choice, laid plainly beside the alternative, an emergency vote was called among the community's homeowners regarding the association's future leadership. The vote, held over the course of a single tense evening in the very clubhouse whose ownership had sparked this entire conflict, resulted in an overwhelming decision to remove Diane Marsh from her position as president effective immediately. Residents who had once applauded her confident dismissals now stood in near unanimous agreement that new leadership was needed to rebuild trust and move the community forward honestly. Diane left the meeting that night without addressing the crowd, her once commanding presence reduced to a quiet, hurried exit through a side door most residents barely noticed. In her place, the community elected a small interim board composed largely of residents who had spoken up earliest about wanting transparency, including Carol Ashford, who reluctantly agreed to help guide the transition. Within a week, this new board reached out directly to Nathan and Robert, requesting an in-person meeting to begin negotiating the terms of a legitimate agreement for the land their community depended on. Nathan agreed without hesitation, understanding that the goal had never been to punish the ordinary families who called that community home, but simply to correct a wrong that had been allowed to continue for far too long. The meeting between Nathan and the new interim board took place in Robert's small conference room, a stark contrast to the tense courtroom exchanges of just weeks earlier. Carol Ashford spoke first, offering a sincere apology on behalf of the community for how Nathan had been treated from the very first day he arrived at that gate. She acknowledged that many residents, herself included, had allowed themselves to be misled by leadership they trusted without asking the harder questions sooner. Nathan accepted the apology graciously, telling the board plainly that his goal from the beginning had simply been fairness, not revenge against people who had, for the most part, unknowingly benefited from someone else's wrongdoing. Over the following weeks, both sides worked through the details of a long-term lease agreement, setting reasonable annual payments that would fund necessary community maintenance while finally, properly compensating Nathan for the use of his land. During one of their final negotiating sessions, Carol asked Nathan why he had never once, throughout the entire ordeal, tried to use the situation to take more than what seemed fair. Nathan thought about the question for a moment before answering that he had spent years working construction sites where a single miscalculated measurement could cause a building to fail years down the line, and he had learned that fairness built things that lasted, while greed only built things that eventually collapsed. Carol nodded slowly at that, telling him it was the kind of answer she wished Diane had understood a long time before any of this ever became necessary. The agreement also established clear, transparent financial reporting requirements for the association going forward, ensuring that no future leadership could quietly divert funds the way Diane Marsh once had. When the final documents were signed, no homeowner lost their home, no family was displaced, and the clubhouse, lake, and tennis courts remained exactly where they had always been, now simply operating under a legitimate agreement rather than a hidden deception. In the months that followed, Diane Marsh found herself facing consequences that extended well beyond losing her position within the community. The financial irregularities uncovered during the lawsuit prompted a separate investigation by county officials, examining whether her handling of association funds had crossed from mismanagement into outright fraud. Several residents who had lost confidence in her leadership pursued their own civil claims, seeking to recover a portion of the dues they felt had been misused during her years in charge. Her name, once spoken with a kind of wary respect throughout the community, became instead a quiet cautionary tale, mentioned occasionally at gatherings as a reminder of what unchecked authority could allow to happen. Susan Reyes, whose quiet record-keeping had done more to expose the truth than any single courtroom argument, was later asked by the interim board to help design a permanent financial oversight committee for the community going forward. She agreed, insisting only that every report the committee produced be made freely available to any resident who asked, a small condition that spoke volumes about what the community had learned. Carol Ashford remained on the board for just over a year before stepping back into a quieter role, satisfied that the system she had helped put in place no longer depended on any one person's vigilance to function properly. Gary Holt, the retired mechanic who had first called Nathan with his doubts, often joked afterward that he never expected a phone call to a stranger would end up saving his neighborhood, though no one who lived through those months found the comment particularly funny. The community itself changed in smaller, quieter ways too, with residents attending meetings more regularly and asking harder questions than they ever had before Nathan's arrival forced them to. What had once been a place defined by unquestioned trust in its leadership slowly became a place defined instead by shared responsibility, which, as several longtime residents agreed, was a far sturdier foundation to build a neighborhood upon. Nathan, for his part, largely stepped back from the community's daily affairs once the lease agreement was finalized, visiting occasionally to walk the property and check on the land, standing near the entrance gate one quiet afternoon, watching children ride bicycles down streets that had once been the center of so much conflict. Nathan finally understood something about his uncle's long silence, a man who perhaps simply never found the right moment to reveal what he truly owned. Nathan eventually climbed a small rise overlooking the entire community, the same hill his uncle had likely stood upon decades earlier before any of this had been built. From there, he could see the full 1,100 acres spread before him, the lake catching the afternoon light, the clubhouse roofline visible above the trees, the neat rows of homes belonging to families who now lived there honestly, without the shadow of a hidden deception hanging over their community. He had not fought this battle for money, and in the end, the financial terms of the settlement had been modest compared to what he legally could have demanded from an association that had wronged him from the very first moment they met. What mattered to him instead was something far simpler, a principle he had believed in long before he ever inherited a single acre of land. No one, regardless of how much power, confidence, or institutional authority they claimed to hold, had the right to take what belonged to someone else and simply call it their own. As the sun began to set over Coleman Ridge Estates, casting long shadows across land that had finally found its rightful honest order, Nathan turned and walked back down the hill, satisfied not by triumph, but by the quiet, lasting weight of justice finally done right.